Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Shah for Parshat Toldot. This November 20th, 2020, Parshat Toldot 5781. And this week's Parsha tells the story of the birth and upbringing of Yaakov and Eisav, and the conflict between them, which begins before they're even born and leads in the end to Yaakov having to leave town in order to escape from his brother Eisav. Throughout their relationship, Yaakov uses guile and subterfuge in order to gain the advantage over his brother. First, he takes advantage of Eisav, who is exhausted and famished after returning from a hunting expedition, in order to buy the firstborn rights from him in exchange for some lentil stew. And later, when Rivka overhears that Yitzchak plans to give his blessing to his older son Eisav, she convinces Yaakov, who's her favorite, to trick his father into giving the blessing to him instead. Now, at first read, Yaakov and Rivka's behavior seems highly questionable. And we might well wonder how someone so seemingly ruthless and devious could inherit the spiritual and the material blessings of Avraham and Yitzchak and merit to become the father and the namesake of God's chosen people. That is a very good question and one worth exploring, but I am not going to address that question in this week's Drasha. If you're interested in exploring Yaakov's character and his merit, you can join my Parshat HaShavua class for Parshat Vayishlach on Thursday, December 3rd at 11:30 a.m. You can register for the Zoom link to that class on the Eisav website. And in that class, we'll be exploring more of this question. How is it that someone who engages in dubious behavior merits to become the father of the people of Israel? What I want to focus on today is not why Yaakov merited the blessing and the birthright, but why Eisav, the oldest son, his father's favorite, the presumptive heir, didn't. The Midrash in Breshit Rabbah offers an answer to that question of why Eisav didn't deserve to be the heir by accusing him of violating the big three cardinal sins: idolatry, murder, and adultery. And it strongly implies that Eisav may have been a rapist to boot. So if that's true, then it's clear that someone like that is unfit to be the heir, and that answers our question. We can go home. But the Midrashic answer is a bit unsatisfying, because if these sins were the reason for Eisav's fall from favor, aren't they mentioned explicitly in the text? So instead of taking the Midrash's word for it, I want to examine the text of the Torah itself in an attempt to understand what was so wrong with Eisav that not only his mother, Rivka, but even God himself would reject him in favor of the devious and ruthless Yaakov. The two stories in which Yaakov supplants his brother each highlight a different aspects of Eisav's character, which I think all too often we ignore because we're so focused on Yaakov's behavior. In chapter 25, we read that Yaakov stewed a stew. And then when Eisav came in from the field, exhausted, Eisav says, "Give me some of that red stuff, because I'm faint." And when Yaakov demands that Eisav first sell him his firstborn status, and then he'll give him the stew, or in Esav's words, the red stuff, Eisav replies, "I'm going to die. What good does being the firstborn son do me?" Esav's behavior here is that of someone who is extremely impulsive. Someone with strong appetites, literally, he's very hungry, but also I think figuratively. Upon seeing this tasty stew, he demands instantly to be given some. "Give me some of that red stuff." And he's willing to sell his extra share of the inheritance just to get a bowl. The trade-off at first seems absurd. And in order to make sense of Esav's behavior, we might be tempted to assume that when he says, "I'm going to die, what good is the birthright to me?" maybe he was being literal. Maybe he was about to starve to death. However, I don't think we need to go that far. However irrational it might seem to trade one's inheritance for a bowl of soup, people do more irrational things than that every day. People binge drink. People decide, today's the day I'm going to try heroin. People commit crimes that wind up putting them behind bars for the hope of fairly modest financial gain. People engage in all kinds of risky behavior that doesn't make sense from the outside. However, some of these seemingly irrational choices are actually perfectly rational if we take into account what economists and psychologists call future discounting. We all discount the future in the choices we make. If I offered to give you $1,000 today or $1,001 a year from now, most people would say, "I'll take $1,000 today." That extra dollar, $1,001 a year from now, is not worth as much to me as $1,000 today, even not accounting for inflation. But how much we discount the future varies from one person to another. Someone might say, "You know what? If I offered you $2,000 a year from now or $1,000 today," some people would take the $2,000 a year from now, while other people would choose to take $1,000 today. How much we discount the future is in some ways simply an idiosyncratic quirk of our personalities, but it also makes sense that the closer we believe we are to death, the more we're going to discount the future. Right? Remember, Eisav said, "I'm going to die. What good is my birthright to me?" So certainly if we thought Eisav was literally about to die, yeah, his birthright ain't worth a whole lot compared to the bowl of soup that might keep him alive. But even if we don't take that literally, Eisav was someone who seemed to expect that he might die at any minute. And so future rewards were not worth much to him. People whose future looks bleak, who are uncertain of their future, are more likely to engage in risky behavior that wouldn't make sense for a person who felt they had a bright future ahead of them. This is one reason that we see crime and drug use go up when economic opportunity declines. When you don't see a future ahead of you, you're going to discount the future and make riskier choices. Eisav, it seems, was someone who discounted the future at a very high rate. while his firstborn rights might have been worth more in the long term than a bowl of soup. Those benefits would only come at some indefinite date in the future when Eisav could not be sure that he would be around to enjoy them. So Eisav is impulsive and a rather extreme future discounter. But are those moral failings? Certainly not moral failings to the degree of murder, idolatry, adultery, which the Midrash accuses him of. But they are traits that are not desirable in someone who is going to be the founder and leader of a spiritual community. God is eternal. His Torah is eternal. And the people of Israel, as God's treasured possession, and the possessors in turn of his eternal Torah, must be oriented towards eternity, towards the extreme long term. We could not have survived and kept our tradition alive through 2,000 years of exile if we didn't understand how to focus on the long term, if we instead focused on immediate gratification. This contrast between Eisav and Yaakov is hinted at, as the Torah so often does, through a subtle play on words. Eisav is a hunter, and the word tzayid, hunt, appears several times in the story in reference to him. By contrast, in this story, Yaakov stewed a stew. Vayazed Yaakov nazid. So we have tzayid and vayazed nazid. All that separates Esav's hunting from Yaakov's stewing is the difference between a tzadi and a zayin. The difference in the way Germans pronounce the letter Z and the way Americans do. Z versus ts. All it is vocalizing or not vocalizing the sound. So we have the stewer and we have the hunter. Eisav is a successful hunter precisely because of his quick instincts. Yes, a hunter needs patience to wait around for the prey to show up. But once it does, he has to act quickly before it can escape. His skill as a hunter is precisely because of his impulsiveness, his ability to listen to his instincts and act without thinking. Yaakov, by contrast, stews a stew. Stewing is slow cooking. It's a matter of being deliberate and steady and not turning the heat up too high. Stewing is about understanding that good things take time, an understanding that Eisav apparently lacks. Without any appreciation of the slow, steady work of keeping the fire going, they didn't have a gas stove or a crock pot. So Yaakov, to stew something, you've got to keep just the right amount of warm coals under the pot the whole time. It's a lot of work. And without appreciating any of that, Eisav says, give me some of that red stuff. He just sees something red and delicious looking. Now, if that were not enough to disqualify Eisav from the inheritance, and it is certainly a far cry, as we've said, from murder, idolatry, adultery. Another character flaw of Eisav's is revealed in their father's blessing. Eisav cries out at this point a great and a very bitter cry. Za'aka gedola umara ad me'od. A very great and bitter cry. He speaks of his brother. After that, he says, is he not rightly called Yaakov, which means the heel? For he has supplanted me, Yarakveni, 2 times. And then in the end, we read that Eisav hates his brother in his heart and makes up his mind to murder Yaakov. So we start out with anger, which leads to resentment, to hatred, and to murder, or the intention to murder at any rate. When I want to look at Eisav's bitter cry, the Hebrew word for bitter, marah, can also mean bile, which is the bodily humor associated with anger. And many commentators have suggested that Eisav's problem was an inherently violent and angry nature. The Kli Yakar says this is due to his being born under the zodiac sign of Mars. And he relates this to Eisav's reaction in our first story when he saw the stew. What did Eisav say? He said, "Give me some of that red stuff." And the Kli Yakar says, why didn't he call it stew? Why didn't he say, "Give me some of that stew, give me some of those lentils"? However, says the Kli Yakar, Eisav was revealing his true nature here, which is that he was irretrievably drawn to all things red. He was bloodthirsty and violent and obsessed with blood and red stuff. So by that account, we're getting a little closer to the Midrash's portrayal of a murderer, an idolater, and an adulterer, someone who's obsessed with redness, blood. But I read the text of the Torah and I don't see someone who's a homicidal maniac who just loves violence for violence's sake. Rather, I see an ordinary person with some impulse control issues who responds to feeling wronged by following an all too relatable path from anger, that great and bitter cry, to resentment, insulting his brother. Oh yeah, he really is rightly called the heel, Jacob. To hatred, hating his brother in his heart, and finally to violence. Unfortunately, you don't have to be born under the zodiac sign of Mars to follow that path. And for that reason, anger has long been understood within our tradition to be a very dangerous emotion. Rambam, who gently advises moderation in all things, singles out anger as a trait that is too dangerous to be indulged in at all, even in moderation. Of course, we all get angry now and then. But how do we respond to that anger? Yaakov got angry. Yaakov responded quite angrily to Lavan on at least 2 occasions. But the difference is that where Eisav allows his anger to lead him down the path of hatred, Yaakov directly confronts the one who has wronged him and rebukes him. It's as simple as, what parents tell their kids, use your words. These contrasting approaches are a show between Yaakov's approach of and Eisav's approach of hatred are highlighted again later in the Torah, in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 17, we are commanded, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Remember, we read, Eisav hated his brother in his heart. This is a direct reference to our Parsha. Rather, reprove, using the repetitive infinitive language for emphasis, reprove your kinsman and do not sin on his account. The verse is giving us 2 options for how to respond to anger. It's saying, don't follow the path of Eisav and bottle it up, hating your brother in your heart until you do violence or otherwise wrong them. Instead, follow the path of Yaakov and have that hard conversation. Rebuke is much harder. But if we think about the long term, hatred only does harm to ourselves and those as well as those we hate. While rebuke, the more difficult in the short term, in the long term, can lead to healing, to understanding, and to the correction of errors and sins. May we, all of us, be blessed with Yaakov's ability to see the long-term vision, with his faith in the future, so that when we do experience anger, we can have the courage and the discipline not to let it fuel resentment and hatred, as Eisav did, but instead let it provoke us to have frank and difficult conversations with those who have hurt us or whom we suspect of doing wrong. Hatred and resentment are mighty appealing in the short term. But in the long term, our blessing and our birthright depend on being able to speak up against wrongdoing clearly and yet without hatred. The alternative to hatred is not to stifle our anger and silently acquiesce to evil and wrongdoing. The alternative to hatred is to engage in thoughtful rebuke. May we find within ourselves the strength, the courage, the wisdom to perform this very difficult mitzvah of rebuke, and to trust